The audio was unmistakable. Ethan's voice calm, Ruth's whisper. Let them come. I'm ready. It is Lig. In less than an hour, the video had 2.3 million views. In 2, it had gone global. At Blake Industries headquarters, the panic was immediate. PR teams flooded the phones, spinning stories faster than Richard could prove them. But nothing stuck. No explanation could undo what the world had seen. At 9:14 a.m., the board of directors issued a rare public. We are deeply disturbed by the emerging revelations. Effective immediately, Richard Blake has been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. By 10:30, stock prices began to fall, and by noon the FBI requested an interview. Richard didn't respond. He didn't show up at his office. He didn't issue a denial because Richard Blake was already gone. At Ethan's estate, the atmosphere was hushed but electric. Reporters had begun gathering at the gates, held back by security. Inside, Ruth sat in the sunroom with a blanket over her knees, watching the birds flit around the feeders. Eva had hung in the yard. I used to sit like this before they took me, she said quietly, pretending the quiet meant safety. Eva knelt beside her. You're not pretending anymore. Ruth smiled. No, baby. Now I remember what safety feels like. Ethan stepped in from the hallway, holding a tablet. They're offering interviews, he said. CNN, NPR, even the New York Times. They all want your story. Ruth looked at him, her eyes soft. Let's not give them just a story. Let's give them a warning. He sat beside her. What do you mean? That evil doesn't always look like a monster, she said. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it calls itself family. But when you tell the truth long enough, someone hears you. Ava reached for Ruth's hand. We heard you. Meanwhile, in a dark motel room on the outskirts of Savannah, Richard Blake paced. His once perfect hair was now unkempt, his tailored suit replaced with a wrinkled shirt and jeans. The television on the wall played his downfall on loop. He watched as Lena's voice narrated over the rescue footage. A woman disappeared for 15 years, not because she was weak, but because she was powerful enough to know the truth. Her silence was enforced, her captivity orchestrated. But her son, once blind, now sees. And the maid they underestimated. She pulled a thread that unraveled a dynasty. Richard hurled the remote at the screen. You stupid boy, he growled. You don't know what you've done. He opened a duffel bag. Cash, burner phones, a fake passport. Then a knock. He froze. Another knock. He reached for the pistol beneath his jacket. Who is it? He barked. A voice replied. Cold, clipped. FBI. Richard didn't move. Mr. Blake, we have a warrant. Step away from the door. Oh! A second passed, then 2. The gun lowered. He walked to the door slowly and opened it. 2 agents stood there, stone-faced Richard Blake. One said, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful detainment, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He said nothing. They cuffed him, let him out. The world watched. That evening, Ethan and Eva sat by the fireplace in the main house. Ruth had gone to bed early, her body still recovering, but her spirit bright. Ethan stared into the flames. I used to think power was about control, he said, about keeping everything locked down so no one could hurt you. Ava leaned her head on his shoulder. And now I know real power is in telling the truth, no matter the cost. She smiled. Sounds like someone I used to work for. He chuckled softly. You still do. She tilted her head. Do I? He turned to her. Not as a maid. Not anymore. I want you beside me. As a partner in everything. Ava studied his face. There was no arrogance now. No superiority. Just sincerity. Okay, she said. But only if we put that horrid garden sculpture in the garage. It scares the kids. He laughed. Deal. The next morning, as the world continued to react to the story, a quiet letter appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an op-ed penned by Ruth Blake. In it, she wrote, they buried me in silence, but silence is not death. I have returned not to seek revenge, but to remind those who feel invisible. You are not alone. Justice may be slow, but it walks with purpose. And the next time they try to hide someone like me, may they remember how loudly the truth can scream. The Blake estate had never been so quiet. After days of headlines, helicopters, and press conferences, it was as if the house itself had exhaled. But the silence now was no longer one of secrets. It was one of healing. The cameras were gone. The protesters had left the gates, and inside, Ruth Blake sat once more in the Grand Library, the very room she had designed decades earlier but hadn't seen in over 15 years. Her fingers grazed the spine of a leather-bound volume of poetry. She opened to a folded page. "Langston Hughes," she whispered. "Still here." Ava entered gently, a tray in her hand with ginger tea and slices of toast. "I figured you might need a break from the chaos," she said. Ruth smiled. "Child, after what I've been through, chaos feels like jazz music now. Messy but familiar." Ava set the tray down. "You've got a call coming in an hour. PBS wants to do a feature interview, and NPR StoryCorps wants to record segment." Ruth shook her head. "I'll do one, but not both. I'm not some headline. I'm someone's mother, a woman who was forgotten. I want my voice to matter, but not because they pity me." Ava sat beside her. "Then you lead the story. You own it." Ruth took her hand. "You taught me how to own it, Ava. You never stopped believing I was worth saving." They sat together, the warmth between them deeper than blood. Meanwhile, Ethan stood in the estate's conference room, facing the newly appointed board members of Blake Industries. Gone were the polished yes men. In their place were hard-faced, diverse professionals, people who had earned their seats, not inherited them. "We reviewed the damage," one of them said. "The company can survive, but only if we cooperate with all investigations, settle claims, and restructure leadership. Starting with you, Ethan." He nodded. "I agree. You're voluntarily stepping down as CEO?" Another asked, surprised. "Yes," Ethan said firmly. "I want transparency, not control." Murmurs moved around the table. "I'll stay on as chair of the foundation." E added, "I want to turn the Blake legacy into something more than luxury and land grabs. Let's rebuild the public trust. Let's rebuild the family name." A pause. Then one board member, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair, leaned forward. "You've changed," she said. "Most men in your position double down. You burned it all down." Instead, Ethan looked toward the window. "I didn't burn it," he said quietly. "The truth did." Later that day, Ava visited a small home on the south side of Atlanta where she had grown up. It was modest 2 bedrooms, peeling paint, a porch swing that squeaked when the wind moved. Her father, Henry, stood on the porch with a newspaper in hand. He looked up when she arrived, eyes glassy but proud. "I read every word," he said. Ava stepped up, heart in her throat. "Dad, I'm sorry," he interrupted. "I didn't believe you. I didn't believe in the job, the people, the danger. I didn't want you to worry. You did more than that. Eva, you made me listen." Thesmonics, they hugged for longer than they ever had before. "I still make a mean pot roast," he said with a smile, "and I hear billionaires like comfort food these days." Ava laughed through her tears. "Only if it comes with cornbread." The next week, Ruth delivered her first public interview. Sitting across from a soft-spoken journalist in a quiet studio bathed in warm light, she told her story not with bitterness but with clarity. "I wasn't buried under concrete," she said. "I was buried under shame. My family's shame. Their greed. And when I tried to speak, they silenced me with signatures and sedatives." The interviewer asked, "How did you survive?" Ruth looked at the camera. "Faith," and a voice inside me that said, "Not yet. Not like this." The segment ended with her reading a passage from one of her old journals. "One day they will forget how to lie, and I will still know how to tell the truth." The clip aired nationwide. It became the most watched interview of the year. In the aftermath, Richard Blake faced a whirlwind of charges: falsifying death records, unlawful detainment, wire fraud, abuse of fiduciary power. His mugshot flashed across every screen in America. For a man who had once spoken at economic summits and hosted senators, the fall was biblical. He was denied bail. During arraignment, he refused to speak, but he looked at the camera once, just once, and the rage in his eyes was pure venom. He had lost not just control, but the narrative. The world no longer whispered in his favor. Back at the Blake estate, Eva stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds as Ethan approached. "They've scheduled the community dinner," he said. "We're turning the estate into a fundraiser. Local causes, scholarships, veteran housing." She smiled. "Your mother would like that. She helped plan it." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed to a new home in her name, near the estate, but not on it. "I want you to have a place of your own," he said. "No more guest house. No more borrowed space." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "You're not trying to buy my forgiveness, are you?" "No," he said softly. "I'm trying to honor the woman who taught me what loyalty means." A long silence passed. Then Eva said, "You're getting there." He laughed. "One day at a time." She nodded. "One truth at a time." "Oh." And together they stood beneath the gold-washed sky, the echoes of the past behind them, and the shape of something new, something honest, rising before them. The church was old, not grand, not ornate, just a red brick chapel nestled between rows of pecan trees on the edge of Marietta, the kind of place where time moved slow and prayers carried weight. Inside, it was standing room only. Neighbors, reporters, former staff from the Blake estate, community leaders, even a few estranged cousins of Blake family all came to witness what had once been unthinkable. Ruth Blake testifying at a public forum, not in court, but in church. She stood behind a modest pulpit, her Sunday hat elegant but not flashy, a black scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes swept the pews, and she smiled, soft, assured. "I used to think silence was safety," she began, "but silence is just a quiet kind of prison." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. I was hidden, forgotten, and yet I was alive. All that time I listened to wind, to birds, to nurses talking outside my door. I memorized voices I never saw. I counted footsteps in the dark. She paused. But the voice I remembered most was my son's. Ethan, when he was a boy, he used to sing off-key just to make me laugh. And when I stopped hearing that music, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. Ethan stood in the back, hands clasped in front of him. His throat was tight. Ava was beside him, steady and present. "I don't stand here today to curse those who wrong me," Ruth said. "I stand here to remind you that truth, once found, is a weapon, a light, a way home." Tears rolled down cheeks. Someone whispered, "Amen." I know. Did," Ruth continued. "The woman who helped bring me back, Ava Jones. She didn't come with a badge. She came with kindness and courage." Ava lowered her head. "She saw me when no one else did, and that kind of seeing, it changes the world." The crowd erupted in quiet applause. Later, as they left the church, an elderly man with a Vietnam vet cap approached Ava. His voice was gravel, but his eyes were soft. "Ms. Jones," he said, "I've got a granddaughter who wants to be a writer. I told her about you. Told her brave comes in all colors." Ava smiled, heart aching in the best way. "She's lucky to have a grandfather like you." "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm lucky. She has a world with women like you in it." That night, Ethan and Ruth sat together on the back porch of the estate. The stars were bright, cleaner somehow than before. "You know what I regret most?" Ruth asked. Ethan shook his head. "That I didn't fight harder when I was first locked away. That I trusted the people who swore they were family." "You survived," Ethan said quietly. "That's not weakness. That's warriorship." She reached over and took his hand. "You remind me of your father sometimes, but softer, more aware." Ethan looked out at the yard. "Do you think he knew?" Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then if he did, he looked the other way. Ethan nodded, the sting of that truth sharp but necessary. "Then I won't," he said. Meanwhile, in a white-collar detention facility outside of Richmond, Richard Blake sat alone in the visiting room. No family, no lawyers, just a man in a suit who didn't belong. Simon Voss, the ex-military security chief who'd once helped Richard hide Ruth, now stared at him across the table. "You were sloppy," Simon said. "I was betrayed," Richard hissed. "No," Simon replied. "You thought loyalty meant fear, but you taught people how to hate you. And now they've learned something stronger than fear." He stood up. "I'm cooperating with the investigation." So are your assistants, your financial advisor, even your ex-wife. You're out of allies. Richard leaned forward, voice low. You helped me. I followed orders, Simon said. That doesn't mean I'll burn with you. And then he left. Richard stared after him, alone for the first time in decades. In the days that followed, the Blake Foundation was renamed the Ruth Blake Center for Justice and Restoration. The announcement went viral. Donations flooded in. Scholarships were announced for women of color pursuing social work and journalism, grants for families fighting conservatorship abuse. Community centers were built in Ruth's name across Georgia. And Ruth, she didn't seek more stages. She walked gardens. She read to children at the library. She made gumbo on weekends. And sometimes when Ava visited, they would sit on the porch in silence, just breathing, just being. One morning, Ava received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single sentence. You were the thunder in a silent storm. Thank you. Below it, Ava folded the letter, heart full. Let them call me a maid, she whispered, but I know I move mountains. It began with a knock on Ava's door, a quiet tap, not urgent, almost uncertain. She had just finished watering the small herb garden outside her new home. The scent of mint and rosemary lingered in the crisp December air. She opened the door to find a courier holding a thick envelope. For Ms. Ava Jones, he said. Signed delivery. Ava signed, thanked him, and stepped back inside. The envelope bore the seal of a high-powered law firm in D.C. She sat on the counter, unsure whether to open it right away. The weight of it felt strange, like something permanent had just entered her life. She took a breath and sliced it open. Inside, a lawsuit, Blake versus Jones, filed by Richard's niece, Cassandra Blake, the only surviving heir still clinging to the family's old power. The suit claimed Ava had manipulated a mentally fragile Ethan Blake, incited public defamation, and acted with malicious intent to defraud the Blake estate. Ava sat down hard. She reread every word. Her hands trembled. Later that morning, she drove to the estate and found Ethan in the garden. He was on his knees, planting winter flowers beside Ruth, who had insisted on learning how to care for chrysanthemums before she turned 80. Ava stood at the edge of the path, holding the letter. He looked up. The moment their eyes met, he knew something was wrong. He rose quickly, wiping his hands on a towel. What is it? She handed him the envelope. Ruth watched, her expression unreadable. Ethan read in silence. His face hardened. Then he looked at Ava. I'll handle it. Ava's voice was low. It's not just about the lawsuit. It's what it represents. They're still trying to silence the truth, and this time they're using me as the scapegoat. Ruth stepped forward, placing a hand on Ava's shoulder. They can't silence you, she said. They're just trying to scare you, like they did me. It's the last gasp of a dying beast. Ethan nodded. We'll counter, publicly and legally. Cassandra's name is still on some of the old trust funds. She's afraid this family is turning into something decent. He turned to Ava. You want to settle this quietly or fight? Ava straightened. We fight. That week, Ava held her own press conference on the steps of the community library Ruth had helped fund. She stood tall, not behind a podium, but surrounded by mothers, students, and elders who had followed her journey. No one owns the truth, she began. Not the wealthy, not the powerful, and certainly not a bloodline built on silencing women. Flashbulbs popped. I will not apologize for uncovering what was hidden. I will not be intimidated into retreat. This lawsuit is not about me. It is about keeping old ghosts alive. But the world has already seen what they tried to bury. Behind her, Ruth stood proud, Ethan at her side. The community rallied. Within 24 hours, Eva's legal fund was fully crowdfunded by thousands of donors, many of them. Small letters poured in from people across the country. You speak for those who have no microphone. You gave my daughter courage to leave her abusive employer. You're the reason I visited my mother again after 10 years. Meanwhile, Cassandra Blake's legal team floundered under pressure. The public outcry against the lawsuit was swift and merciless. Her lawyers quietly offered mediation. Ava refused. By the third week, the judge dismissed the case entirely, calling it a transparent act of retaliatory intimidation with no legal merit. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ava didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply exhaled. For the first time in what felt like weeks afterward, she stood outside with Ethan. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up at the sky. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to do what was right." "You did," he said, "and now they can't touch you." "Tea night." She turned to him. "So what now?" "We rebuild," he said. "Not just the Blake name, the whole legacy. With truth, with service. With you." A long pause passed. Then Ava said, "Then let's do it on our terms." That night, Ruth lit a candle in her bedroom and opened her journal. Her handwriting had grown steadier. The tremble in her hands lessened with each day of freedom she wrote. Today, Ava stood where no one expected her to stand. Against fear, against heritage. And she did not bend. In her I see a reflection. Not the girl I was, but the woman I prayed someone else might become. If legacy means anything, it's what we leave in the hearts of others. Ava's courage is now stitched into the heart of this country. And me, I'm not finished speaking. Back in his study, Ethan reopened a box he hadn't touched in years. It was his father's, the one filled with old letters, photographs, and notes from board meetings long past. Among the papers was a sealed envelope marked, "For Ethan, if I'm gone." He hesitated, opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "Trust your mother's voice over mine." Ethan blinked, then laughed quietly and wept. The small auditorium at Spelman College was packed. Students filled every row. Faculty members lined the back walls. Journalists took notes, their cameras respectfully silent, knowing they were about to witness something rare. A living piece of American history was about to speak, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a woman whose voice had outlived the silence forced upon her. Eva sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had helped organize the event, not because Ruth asked for it. Ruth didn't ask for much, but because the younger generation needed to see her, to hear her, to understand that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Then the MC tapped the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome a woman whose story has shaken a nation, a mother, a survivor, a voice we almost lost. Ruth Blake." The applause rose like a wave, powerful and reverent. Ruth stepped onto the stage, her posture straight, her scarf deep purple, the color of royalty and bruises both. She stood at the center. No notes, no teleprompter, just truth. "When I was taken," she began, "I was told I was unwell, that my mind couldn't be trusted, that everything I remembered was wrong. And when you hear that long enough, you start to wonder, what if they're right?" The room was silent. But then someone shows up. Someone who doesn't know you, doesn't owe you, but sees you, really sees you. She looked at Eva. And suddenly your voice finds its way back. A student near the front wiped a tear. "I spent 15 years in a room that was technically clean, technically safe, and absolutely designed to erase me. But every day I remembered who I was. Not because they let me, because I refused to let them take it." She paused. "You don't need permission to be real." The crowd rose to its feet. This was no longer a speech. It was a sermon, a reclamation. Later, in a quiet side room, Ruth sat with a group of black female students. They crowded around her, peppering her with questions, some laughing, some serious, all respectful. "Ms. Ruth," one girl asked, "how did you know who to trust? I mean, when everyone was lying to you." Ruth smiled softly. "You watch how people treat the quiet things. Like old folks, children, cleaning staff. If they act kind when no one's watching, that's a clue." Another girl asked, "What do you do when the people hurting you were the same last name?" Ruth's eyes didn't flinch. "You forgive when you're ready, but you don't excuse it. And you don't let the past change your present was no." Ava listened quietly in the back, her chest tight with a pride so vast it almost hurt. This wasn't about headlines anymore. This was legacy. Living, breathing, teaching. That weekend back at the estate, Ethan received an unexpected call from the governor's office. "Mr. Blake," the aide said, "the governor would like to present your mother with a civilian medal, recognition for her contribution to justice reform. Ethan looked out the window. Ruth was in the garden pruning roses. She was humming softly. "She'll appreciate the gesture," he said, "but she's not doing this for medals. We understand, but the people want to thank her." He nodded. "Then she'll accept. Not for herself. For the people like her who didn't survive." The ceremony was held at the state capitol. Press covered it. Lawmakers clapped. Ruth accepted the medal with grace and a 2-minute speech that ended with "No award can give me back the years I lost. But if my story helps prevent even one person from being buried while alive, then every second of those years mattered." The applause was thunderous. She wore the medal once, then put it in a drawer beside her wedding ring and never spoke of it again. Meanwhile, Richard Blake sat in his prison cell watching the ceremony on a tiny television mounted in a corner. The image flickered, but the sound was clear. He watched as his mother stood tall, flanked by the governor and his son, the crowd clapping like it was church. He turned off the TV, lay back on the cot, stared at the ceiling. His face was blank, but in his fist the bedsheet twisted tighter and tighter. 1 week later, Eva found a letter slipped into her mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was careful, controlled. "Dear Ava, I did not expect forgiveness. I do not ask for it. But I must acknowledge that without you the truth would have died in a locked room. You did what none of us family, staff, advisors had the courage to do. You saw her. Thank you, Ethan." She held the letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and smiled. That night a small dinner was held at Ruth's home. Just family, a few close friends. No media, no speeches over fried chicken, cornbread, and iced tea. They laughed, cried, told stories. At one point, Ava leaned over to Ethan. "Do you think it's over?" He shook his head. "The lawsuit? The media, maybe. But the work? Never." Ruth raised her glass to the work. They all clinked. And under that old southern moon where truth had once been buried deep beneath shame, the Blake family finally stood on solid ground. The seasons turned. Winter softened its grip, and Georgia's early spring crept in, through bare trees and warm breezes. The grounds of the Blake estate began to bloom again. Daffodils, early dogwoods, tiny crocuses peeking through the mulch like they were testing the world's readiness for something gentle. Inside the main house, the dining room had been transformed not into a gallery of power or luxury, but into a living archive. Ruth's journals, old photographs, her volunteer certificates from before she vanished, all now carefully displayed under glass. At the center of the room sat her rocking chair, draped with a quilt she had stitched during the first year of her detainment. "It's not a museum," she told Eva one afternoon. "It's a memory room. Not just mine. Ours." Eva looked around, then pointed to an empty space on the wall. "You know what would fit there?" Ruth raised an eyebrow. "A mirror. To remind everyone who walks in here that silence doesn't always come from being voiceless. Sometimes it's the world that refuses to listen. I will." Ruth smiled. "That's why you were meant to find me." Meanwhile, Ethan had begun what he called a long apology, a tour of old partnerships, community groups, even union meetings his father once tried to squash at a steelworkers union in Savannah. He stood before a hall of skeptical men and women, mostly black, mostly older, many with memories of being silenced by someone named Blake. "I can't rewrite what my father did," Ethan said, "but I can give back what he took. We're funding legal clinics, we're restoring pensions, and we're listening." Finally, one of the union elders crossed his arms. "You think money fixes trust?" Ethan didn't flinch. "No, but showing up every month for the next 5 years might start to." The elder studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Then we'll be watching, Mr. Blake." "Please," Ethan said. Just Ethan. Back at the estate, Ava began teaching free weekend classes for teenage girls. The group started small, just 5 at first, but grew with every story Ava told, every lesson she modeled. She called it the Seeing Project. "It's not about changing the world," she told the girls. "It's about seeing it clearly and choosing who you want to be, even when it costs you." One Saturday, she brought Ruth in as a surprise guest. The room lit up. One teen raised her hand. "Ms. Ruth, were you scared?" "All the time," Ruth answered. But fear doesn't stop the truth. It just delays it. Another girl asked, what did it feel like to come back to the world? Ruth paused, like learning to breathe again, but deeper, like purpose. Later that evening, Eva walked the garden paths alone. The moonlight painted the hedges silver. She paused at the bench near the oldest tree, a sprawling pecan that had stood there longer than the estate itself. Ethan found her there, holding a small box. I've been thinking, he said. That always makes me nervous, she teased, glancing up at him. He smiled, then handed her the box. Inside was a necklace, simple, with a charm shaped like an eye. For seeing, he said, not just others. Yourself. Ava swallowed hard. I don't need gifts. It's not a gift, Ethan said. It's a thank you for giving this family back its soul. She ran her fingers over the charm. I was never trying to fix the Blakes. I know, he said. You were just trying to help a woman who was hurting, and that's what saved all of us. They sat in silence for a while. Then Eva said, ever think about what comes next? Not the lawsuits or the press. Just life. All the time. You? Ethan replied. But I don't want it to be about making things right anymore. I want it to be about being right. She turned to him. You're getting there. He looked at her. So are you? It was not elsewhere. In a small rehab facility upstate, Simon Voss, the ex-security chief who once kept Ruth locked away, sat with a counselor. He had voluntarily surrendered his license, was cooperating with investigators, attending therapy twice a week. I thought I was protecting the family, he said quietly, but I was protecting corruption, because it was clean and paid on time. The counselor asked, and what do you want now? Simon exhaled. To unlearn. To unlearn obedience without question. To unlearn power without mercy. To unlearn the idea that silence equals loyalty. As the estate's first spring bloom arrived, Ruth received an invitation in the mail. A commemorative garden was being planted in her honor at Spelman College, featuring flora native to the South, each chosen for symbolism. Magnolias for dignity, hyacinth for sorrow, camellias for endurance. She held the letter close to her chest. I lived 15 years in a room with no windows, she whispered, and now they want to name a garden after me. Ava heard her. You earned every petal. At the dedication ceremony, students read passages from Ruth's journals aloud. Eva gave a short speech, and Ethan stood beside her, holding Ruth's hand the entire time. When it was Ruth's turn, she walked slowly to the podium, paused to smell the camellias, and smiled. They tried to lock me in, she said, but life finds cracks in every wall. The garden shimmered with applause. It was not revenge. It was not a comeback. It was a routing. Ruth Blake had not simply returned to the world. She had replanted herself in it. Summer arrived early that year. The air in Georgia turned thick and sweet, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. Cicadas hummed low in the trees. Life for once slowed down. Not the hurried, frantic silence of cover-up, but the peaceful kind, the kind that follows storms when you know they won't return right away. In the estate's kitchen, Ruth was teaching Ava how to bake her famous blackberry cobbler. No shortcuts, Ruth said, tapping Ava's wrist as she reached for the pre-made crust. This family knows about shortcuts. Look where that got them. Ava laughed. Fine. From scratch. You win. Ruth's hands were steadier now, her voice fuller. She moved with the grace of a woman who had finally outlived her ghosts. I used to imagine this, she said softly, stirring the filling, being in this kitchen again. But I never thought it would be with you. Eva looked at her. Do you miss it? The old days, before everything went wrong? Ruth shook her head. No, baby. The old days weren't good. They were quiet, but not kind. This right now, this is the life I wanted. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have walked through fire together. Outside, Ethan knelt in the garden, his sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow. He was planting marigolds in a new corner they had designated for community use, a place where neighbors could grow vegetables, children could learn about soil, and no one had to ask permission. A little girl approached, holding a watering can almost as big as her torso. Mr. Blake? She asked shyly. Can I help? He smiled. handing her a small trowel. "Only if you promise to water the marigolds like they're royalty." The girl giggled and got to work. A few parents watched from the shade, whispering quietly. "That's him, right?" One asked. "The billionaire?" Another nodded. "Yep, and that's his mama, the one who came back. And the maid, the one who found her. That's her, too, over there." "Not a maid anymore?" "No," the first woman said. "She's something else now. Something more. With me, Delaware." Later that evening, Ethan hosted a small gathering on the back lawn, just a core circle. Ruth, Ava, Lena Kavanaugh, the journalist, a few board members from the Blake Foundation, and a surprise guest, Judge Harper, the retired black judge who had quietly reopened Ruth's case after it was buried over sweet tea and grilled corn. Stories were passed around. Laughter echoed through the trees. At one point, Judge Harper raised his glass. "To Ava Jones," he said, "who reminded us all that justice isn't always loud, but it is always listening." Ava blushed, but her voice was steady. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Ruth added, "but you were the only one brave enough to start." As the sun dipped below the trees, Ethan pulled Ava aside. They stood at the edge of the property, near the old magnolia tree that had stood through generations. "I've been thinking," he said. Ava raised a brow. Again, he chuckled. "We've built something here. Not just a foundation. A life. And I don't want to keep rebuilding it alone." He reached into his pocket. A small box. No speech. Just an open heart. "Ava Jones, will you build the rest of this with me? Not as an employee, not even as a partner, but as family." She stared at the ring, then at him. Then she smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." The news of their engagement spread fast, but not in the flashy style, scandalous way it might have once. Now it was different. One headline read, "From Maid to Matriarch, the woman who rewrote a billionaire legacy." Another simply said, "Truth wins." A few weeks later, Ruth sat alone in the memory room, flipping through one of her old journals. She stopped on a page dated 12 years ago, written during her darkest days. "If no one ever finds me, I hope I at least left a crack, just enough for light to get in." She closed the book. The light was here now, flooding in, not just for her, but for everyone they had touched. For the first time, Ruth Blake allowed herself to believe that peace wasn't a dream. It was earned, and it was here. Outside, Ava walked hand in hand with Ethan as the sun dipped low. Children laughed in the distance. Neighbors waved. The land felt alive. "Do you feel it?" Eva asked. Ethan looked around the quiet. "No," she said. "The difference?" He nodded slowly. "It's in the way they look at us now. Like we're not ghosts. Like we belong." She smiled. "We always did. They just had to see us." And in that golden evening light beneath the tree, where secrets once grew, like rot, a new kind of root took hold. One built on truth, on love, and on the quiet things that last. The Blake estate was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind born of contentment. The soft hush of a house finally free of secrets. Windows open. Curtains dancing in the breeze. Somewhere a piano played a soft hymn, one Ruth used to hum when Ethan was small. It was a Sunday. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass window in the newly converted reading room, casting colors onto the wood floors. Ruth sat in her chair, wrapped in a shawl, eyes closed, not sleeping but remembering. Ava entered with 2 mugs of tea. "Chamomile," she said. Ruth opened her eyes. "You remembered. Some things are worth remembering." They sat in silence for a moment. "I've been thinking about writing it all down," Ava said. "Everything from the beginning." "You should," Ruth replied. "Truth only lives if you tell it, but not as a scandal, not as a revenge story." "No," Ruth nodded. "As a homecoming." Downstairs, Ethan was in the study, sorting through the last boxes of his father's archived records. Most had already been donated to the State Historical Center, documented as part of the family's public reckoning. But this box was personal. Inside were photo albums, not the curated ones used at galas or magazine shoots. These were raw, blurry shots of Ruth laughing in the kitchen, a young Ethan playing in the mud, Ava's first week as a maid caught in the background of a family picnic. She wasn't invited to until now. He smiled, flipped the page. There was one photo that made him stop. Ruth sitting under the old magnolia, Ava beside her, both unaware of the camera. Two women, two timelines, two voices, one story. Outside, preparations were underway for something special, a dedication. The estate was opening part of the grounds to the public, a permanent community center and retreat space called the House That Listens. It would host survivors of systemic abuse, people recovering from wrongful detainment, and caretakers in need of rest. Workshops, healing gardens, story circles. Ava had designed the curriculum. Ethan funded it quietly, anonymously. Ruth approved every detail. "I don't want this to be about the Blakes," she said. "I want it to be about the people who were never invited through the front door." At the opening ceremony, Ava stood at the podium, not nervous, not rehearsed, just real. "We once lived in a house that punished silence." She began. "Now we open a house that listens." She looked out over the crowd. Hundreds gathered. Families, elders, survivors, students. This is not a monument to wealth. It's a promise that your voice matters, that you are seen. She paused. "And that healing doesn't need permission." Thunderous applause followed. Ruth smiled from her chair, tears brimming. Ethan took her hand. "We did it," he whispered. "No, son," she said. "She did it. We just finally followed." That night, the three of them sat on the back porch sipping sweet tea, wrapped in a shared peace that came only after long storms. The stars were clear. The trees swayed gently. Ava said, "Do you ever think about how easily this could have gone the other way?" Ruth answered, "Every day." Ethan leaned forward. "So what made it go this way?" Ruth looked at Ava. "You." Then she turned to Ethan. "And you." She looked up at the stars. "And a God who doesn't forget us, even when the world does." They were quiet after that, but it wasn't emptiness. It was gratitude, the deep kind, the kind that lasts. Months passed. Life continued. Ethan and Ava married in a quiet ceremony under the magnolia tree. Just family, friends, and neighbors. No press, no spectacle. Just vows, tears, and hands held tight. Ruth gave a speech. It was only one sentence. "Justice without love is just another prison." Years later, children would walk through the house that listens and see a framed photo in the main hall. Ruth, Ava, and Ethan, three live forever entwined by truth, by courage, by grace. They would ask, "Who are they?" And the guides would say, "That's the woman who was forgotten. That's the woman who found her. And that's the man who learned how to listen." And in that house, in that story, they would all remember. Some truths are louder than silence, and some homes are built not of bricks. But a voice is finally heard. The story reminds us that true justice isn't always delivered in courtrooms or headlines. It often begins with one person choosing to see what others ignore. It teaches us that silence can be as cruel as violence, and that healing starts when we listen with compassion. Above all, it shows that even in a world built on power and secrecy, courage, truth and love can still rewrite the ending.